We are getting close to wrapping up our series on the life of Joseph. This morning we're going to look at the death of Jacob, his father. Then next Sunday we are going to talk about probably what I consider to be one of the greatest lessons in the life of Joseph. It comes not only from Joseph but from his brothers. And we're going to just spend a lot of time there next week. And then the following week, we'll wrap it up with the death of Joseph and just some overall observations and lessons from his life. But this morning, we're looking at Jacob. And we spent about 3 weeks on this because there's 3 chapters in which God deals with the death of Jacob. And what's significant about that is actually God spends more time talking about Jacob's death than he does the creation story. So there's a lot to unpack as we look at this story. So this morning we're going to start with basically the end of Jacob's life. And here's what it says. It says, then he gave, speaking of Jacob, which is Joseph's dad, then he gave him these instructions. I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. Remember, his Rachel had been buried near Bethlehem. He said the field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his son, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but it does not say he died. It says he drew up his feet, breathed his last breath, and gathered to his people. We'll talk about the significance of that in a little bit. Joseph threw himself on his father, and he wept over him and kissed. And Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming, and the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days. And when the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, if I found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him my father made me swear an oath. I'm about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father, and then I will return. And Pharaoh said, go and bury your father. So he made as he made you swear to do. So Joseph went up to bury his father. All of Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court, the dignitaries of Egypt, beside all the members of Joseph's household and their brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and herds were left in Goshen. Chariot and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company. And when they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. That is why the place near Jordan is called Abel Mizraim. So Jacob's son did as he commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan. They buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field as a burial place for Ephraim the Hittite. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all those who had gone with him to bury his father. So let's talk about some things and make sure we understand the story, and then we'll get into the application of it. First of all, what's interesting here is it is not about Jacob as much as it about the place. And that's important in this story, because in this story you have to understand when Jacob says, I want to go back to Canaan, he keeps talking about over and over again this idea of bury is mentioned so many times in this passage, because the idea is it's about going back to the land that my great-grandfather had purchased as a burial place for our people. In other words, it was a way of looking forward, because this was the land we were supposed to be in, that God promised us. So he spends a lot of time talking about the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah and Rachel and or Rebekah and Isaac and Leah had been buried. So that becomes a significant idea here. What's interesting is, like I said, it does not say he died. It says he gathered up his feet, he breathed his last breath, and he was gathered to his people. And we'll talk about the hope and the idea that he has when a child of God passes away. And they go into a lot of detail about what the procedure was. In this case, the first thing to do is they embalm the body. What's significant in the story is that the physicians embalmed Jacob, not the embalmers. A lot of Bible scholars believe that. The reason for that is the embalmers were often associated with the gods of Egypt, so they would do a lot of the gods' ritual kind of stuff associated with the Egyptian god, whereas the physicians wouldn't have done that. The Bible only talks about two people that are embalmed, Jacob and Joseph. And so Joseph here has Jacob embalmed by the physicians. It talks about a period here of 70 days. He talks about a period of 40 days and 70 days. The 40 days was probably part of the 70 days, okay? So only like 40 plus 70, it's like 40 and then another 30 days after that. So they went through this whole process. That's important because that gives us some insight as to this whole grieving idea. And then what happens is, for whatever reason, Joseph does not go to Pharaoh. Joseph sends somebody to Pharaoh. And a lot of people believe the reason that they did that is because Joseph, probably under the Egyptian culture, would have been ceremonially unclean, because when his father passed away, it says that he kissed him and he weeps and he touches that body. I think that's like the sixth time that in the book of Joseph, in the life of Joseph, we see him crying. But it's this idea of seriously weeping and mourning the death of his father. He talks about then this idea of they embalmed him, and then he goes to Pharaoh and he says, I need to go back. Now, think about this for a second, because this is a risk. He's about ready to take all of his family back to Canaan, where he's from, and Joseph has been an integral part of the survival of Egypt. So one of the things that happens is he leaves all of the animals and their children, which is kind of a guarantee to Pharaoh that we will come back. And so he says, look, can we go and do this? And they say, yeah, you can go and do this. So they take off on this journey. Now, we're not sure exactly where, but the way the text reads, we think that he kind of went about the same route that the children of Israel would have originally gone had they not had to wander for 40 years, where they just kind of went around the south and then crossed over to the Jordan River. And it says there, so I want you to think about this now, because, you know, he's got a large family at this point. And they have all of these people traveling, and then in addition to that, you have the military presence of Pharaoh traveling. This is a massive group. And there's a lot that is going on with this thing. And they finally get just outside of Canaan there in the Promised Land, and they come to this threshing floor. Now, the way it was designed is a threshing floor would have been an area outside of the city, first of all. And it would have been an elevated area, and it was usually flat and large. Because again, as they would thresh wheat and they would throw it up, they'd want the wind to blow it off and blow it down in the valley, and then they had the kernels of wheat and stuff that they needed. So it would have been a great area for a large group to gather. And so when they're there, they mourn. They spend 7 days mourning. Then they take the bones and the mummified body now of Jacob, and they take it all the way to the cave there at Machpelah and bury him there. And then it says, the text says then that they head back. Now, I just want you to think about this for a second. You know, when we go, it's not like when I went to Virginia, okay? I got on a plane at 7 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, I'm here. No, it's much different. You're traveling, and you're traveling with a large group. So at the end of the day, as you're sitting there and you're making supper and there's a campfire and everybody's sitting around, now you've got the stories. And I'm sure the brothers are telling the stories about, hey, you remember when Dad did this? And again, this would have been all foreign to Joseph, because Joseph had been away for almost 40 years. And even the boys, it had been 17 years 17 to 20 years since they had been back to Canaan. They'd been living in Egypt the whole time, and now all of a sudden they're back in this area. And think of the emotions that come flooding back as you come back into this place that you've been gone from for so long. You have all of the stories and everything else, and then the text says that they get back and they go back to Egypt and they go back to their life. I think there's a ton of lessons in here for us, dealing with death and mourning and grief and life and all of that kind of thing. So let me just kind of hit a couple of them. One of them is this. Often when people get to this text about Jacob, they tend to use it as a argument for burial instead of cremation. One of the questions that I get a lot of times as a pastor, particularly in our culture now, is what does the Bible say about burial versus cremation? How do we address those things as Christians? And some people use this text to promote the idea that as Christians we should always bury a body. And again, we have Abraham and Sarah, and we have all of the stories before, and then we have at the death of John the Baptist that happening, and then we have the death of Jesus that happening. So people want to kind of tend to use it as a proof text and say, this is the way it should always be done. When you really look at the Bible, here's what you find. You find that there's actually a situation in the Bible where cremation is done. It's an odd story, but it's the story of the death of Saul and his sons. It comes at the end of the book of Samuel when what happens is Saul realizes his army is going to lose, and he asks his armor bearer to kill him, and his armor bearer refuses, so Saul falls on his sword. And he takes his life, and what happens is then when the Philistines come back into the area and they start taking the spoils, if you were, and they find Saul and his son, they cut off his head, and they take his armor and they start sending his armor around, and as a trophy they take his dead body and they hang it on the wall. And then with his three sons, they take their bodies, their headless bodies, and hang them on the wall. And that was a way in that culture, which what you were saying is, this is the king, and this is what we do to kings. So don't mess with us. Well, it's interesting because there's a group of God followers in Jabesh Gilead. And it says that the mighty men of Jabesh Gilead go into that city, and they take the bodies of Saul and his sons down. They bring them back to their area and they burn them. And then they take whatever bones are left and they get rid of the bones and bury the bones. What you see in that story is this. The idea of cremating or burning the bodies of Saul and his sons was actually a way to honor them because their enemies were dishonoring their bodies. And I think when you look at the Bible stories and when you look at history and you look at the whole idea of cremation and burial and all those kinds of things, in some cultures, it was a way to honor, like in the Viking culture, it was a way to honor a warrior. In some cultures, they would burn a body as a way to dishonor the body so that it was like, okay, we don't want anybody visiting a grave. We don't want anybody even knowing this person existed. So I think when you look at it biblically, when you look at this idea of cremation or burial, I think one of the issues that comes up is this. We have an obligation to honor the person that we are burying. Whether that be by burial or whether that be by cremation, the issue is honor. And so I think, so one of the questions when people ask me, I say, well, why do you want to do cremation? If they look at me and say, well, I hate this person and I want them gone and I don't want anybody to even know they existed and stuff like that, then I go, okay, we probably have a little bit bigger issue than whether or not we bury them or cremate them. What I find often is it is either economical, it's a money issue, it is a scheduling issue. We can't get everybody here for the funeral. We can do the funeral better at a later date. It is a way to honor them. We want to be able to share the ashes with a number of people. So, what I always encourage people is I think you have to ask yourself, why are you doing this? Is this a way for you to honor their life? I will say this as a pastor, and one of the things that has happened is cremation, because of finances, is becoming more and more of a option for people. It's also created a whole other set of issues for people, and this is what I tell families. If you know, you go, I've done both. In fact, when we did Jean's families, her dad was cremated, her mom, we had a casket. At the graveside, we did them both at the same time. What I tell people is this, my advice, my counsel is this. Number one, I think you have to have a plan for the ashes. I see too many situations where nobody had a plan for them. And so, in fact, we deal with this with Jean's family in that Charlie had one brother who Charlie was really the only family member, and they gave the urn to Charlie. And then Charlie passed away, now nobody knows what to do with it, you know. So you have to have a plan for what you're doing. I know I struggled with this when Doug passed away, because of Doug's medical condition and the condition that his body was in, just ravaged with cancer. We had to, cremation was really the best option for him. And so, you know, for a long time I had some of Doug's ashes, and I had to figure out a way to honor them, to do something with them. And I was able to figure out a way for me to do that. But so I always tell families, A, have a plan, and B, I think, it's not biblical, although I could probably make a biblical argument for it, but I think you need to have a marker somewhere. I think you need to, you know, and we're fortunate. We live in an area where you can buy a graveside plot fairly cheap. And so there's just somewhere for people to be able to go for closure and that kind of thing. I think that's important. One of the things that you see in this story is they buried his bones, and you're going to see this in the life of Joseph too, where Joseph's bones, it's like 400 years before they get carried into the promised land. So, you know, even then they had a plan and a purpose. So I think you see that. I think you see this idea that when someone passes away, one of the things that we have to do is we have to find a way to honor them. And what you see in the story, by the way, is this is a long process. This is 70 days, and then another traveling, and then another 7 days, and then traveling back. I mean, there's a significant amount of time in that process for Jacob. I think the second thing that you see as you look at this thing is you see Jacob's view of death. That's the thing that I think gives me hope as I look at this story. It doesn't say Jacob died. How does it picture his leaving this world? He draws up his legs, he takes his last breath, and he's gathered to his people. For Christians, one of the things that you'll find is for those of us that are put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ, our Father has prepared, you know, Jesus has gone to prepare a home for us in heaven. So it is literally in fact, in the New Testament, it's often referred to as sleep. It's literally I go to sleep here, I wake up there. I take my last breath here, I wake up there. I leave my friends and family and people here, and I'm gathered to my people there. There's this incredible transition, if you will, from this world to the next for those of us who are believers. And that's why the New Testament says we don't sorrow as those who have no hope because of the resurrection. So as much as I miss my friend who passed away this week, went home to be with the Lord, as much as I miss him, I'll see him again. Because I have that hope. Now, let me talk about the elephant in the room. Because again, you know, I'm dealing with a lot of things that, as a pastor, I struggle with when we deal with these kinds of things. You look at somebody who has passed away, and you go, well, I don't think they were a Christian. It didn't have anything to do with God. And I know that the Bible teaches that Jesus Christ is the only way, the only truth, the only life. No one comes to the Father but through him. And I know they didn't put their faith and trust in Christ, so I know they're without Christ, and now I'm struggling. Can I caution you to be very, very careful here? Be very, very careful here. Because let's be honest here. I know what you say about your faith, but there's only one person in this building, there's only one person listening right now that I know for sure is on their way to heaven. And that's me. Because I know about my relationship with Jesus Christ. I know what my wife says, but I don't know her heart. Only her and God know her heart. So the reality of it is, the only one that I can be assured of ever for sure is me. Everybody else, I can go by what they say. I can look at what they do maybe, but that doesn't mean I know. By the way, we talk about baptism. That's why one of the things that I think baptism is so important, because it's a public statement to everybody. This is where I stand before God. This is about my relationship. And so, but even then, when somebody's baptized, you're going by their testimony. So often at a funeral, I'll say based on their testimony. I believe they're with Jesus Christ. But I don't know. Think about this for a second. If I was asked to do the funeral of the thief on the cross, with his dying breath, with his last dying breath, what did he say? He put his faith and trust in Christ, and Jesus hanging on the cross, and some of the last words that he ever speaks says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." If you were to look at his life, or if you were to stand at a funeral for him and talk about everything that he had done and how horrible he was, and he didn't want anything to do with God, and he had never been to a church, and he was just a thief, and da-da-da-da-da-da, but you're going to see him in heaven. So be very, very careful on making the assumption on anyone who you think may or may not have put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. As I tell families often, you don't know what goes through somebody's mind in the last moments of their life. You don't know what decision they've made. You're just basing what you believe on externals or things that you've seen, just like you would the thief on the cross, and that's not a fair assessment. So my job as a believer, my job as a Christian, is to make sure that people know what to do and how to put their faith and trust in Christ. And the rest is between them and God. And so with the life of Jacob, again, we see someone here who has followed God with his life. And when we come to the Bible recording his death, what he says is he drew up his feet, he took his last breath, and he was gathered to his people. And for those of us who are Christians, that's our hope. That's our prayer. That's what we look forward to. The other thing that you see in this story is the grief process. And let me say this. When we talk about loss, it's different for everybody. There's no formula. There's no right or wrong way to do it. I will say there are healthy ways to respond and there are unhealthy ways to respond. As a pastor, when I see somebody handling it maybe in an unhealthy way, I want to try to help them figure out a healthier way to do it. But I think one of the things that you see in this story is you see Joseph weeping at the death of his dad. You see him spending, when it's all said and done, at least 70 days, plus another 7, plus another travel. There's a significant amount of time that he carves out of his life to grieve and walk through this process. Let me talk to guys for a minute, because we tend to be in a world and in a culture in particular where we minimize emotion. And it's almost like, tears are a sign of weakness. I would argue just the opposite. There's no one more manly than Jesus Christ. And yet we find occasions where he weeps. There's no stronger leader than Joseph, and we find at least 6 occasions where he weeps. There's nothing wrong with tears, guys. One of the hardest lessons for me to learn as a pastor is I'm in this odd category. where in order to provide comfort and stability to people who are grieving, you have to keep your emotions in check. You have to box them up. So when I do a funeral, again, I used to do funerals for strangers. Now I'm doing funerals for friends. In some cases, lifelong friendship. And I can't get up and lead a funeral and cry all the way through it and provide comfort, encouragement, and hope and everything else to a family. So one of the things that I had to learn to do early in ministry is take all of my emotions and put them in a little box. And I thought that was the way you handled it. And I started to realize, my wife and my family will tell you, there's probably no more stressful time for me than when I'm trying to do a funeral, because you're trying to honor a life, and you're trying to sum up a life, and you're trying to give comfort. So basically, from the time I'm notified to the time that the funeral's over, my family knows that, I'm just kind of in this little specialty world, so to speak. And so it takes an emotional toll. It really does. And so I have to learn how to box stuff up. And early in ministry, I would box stuff up, and then I would not deal with it. And I finally realized, you know what? This is really unhealthy. Because my family would pay the price for that. I would pay the price for that. And so I started to realize that every time I do a funeral, I have to, for the funeral, box it all up. But I have to later open the box and start working through it. And I found for me, every situation is different. Every situation now, I try to find a unique way to deal with that loss, to deal with that impact. I mean, like I say, I lost a dear friend this week. I will figure out a way to deal with the grief and the emotions and everything that comes with losing my friend. When I lost Doug, my closest friend for 25 plus years, it took me about 3-4 years to figure out a way to process the grief for his life. And what I want to encourage you is that you work through that process. And guys, be as tough as you want, but be honest with yourself and work through it. Like I say, find a healthy way to do it. And we lost both Jean's parents this year. And I had to figure out a way to work through all of that for myself. And like I say, for Joseph, this was he had the physicians embalm the body rather than the embalmers. He goes through that 70-day process. And then it's interesting because when he gets to Canaan, he takes the 7 days that was the Jewish way of dealing with it. And he processes it all. And then they go to the cave and they put the bones in and then the body in, and then they head back, and they have to get back to their world. And that's, I think, the hardest thing for people when we deal with people we lose. Because we feel guilty if we enjoy life. We feel guilty for going forward. We feel like, well, we're forgetting them. No, we're not. I tell families this, and just think about this for a second. What has happened is your world has turned upside down. You can spend all the time you want trying to get the world to turn right side up, but it's never going to do that. Those people aren't coming back. Your world will always be upside down. So just think about this for a second. If you were to go home this afternoon and your whole kitchen was upside down, and I say, can I have a glass of water? And you get a ladder and you go to your sink and you turn it on and the water starts pouring down. I mean, you're going, oh, this is so hard. It's just a glass of water. Yes, it's a glass of water. It's so hard. Eventually, you would learn how to get a glass of water from a sink that's upside down on the ceiling. It's going to take a lot of time to figure it out. It's going to take a lot of work to figure it out. But eventually, you would come up with a set of skills to learn how to live in an upside-down kitchen. And that's exactly what we have to do when we lose someone. We have to learn how to adapt to an upside-down world. And you know as well as I do, if you were to leave this world today, those of you who have a spouse, what kind of world would you want them to have from that point on? Would you want them to be happy? Would you want them to go forward? Would you want them to get back into the world and function? Sure you would. You know? I mean, one day the Lord's going to call me home, and when I'm done here, when He's done with me here, then the reality of it is this church is going to have to go forward without me. My wife is going to have to go forward without me. My kids, my grandkids, people are going to, and there's no greater joy for me than that they go on with their life. That's what I want from them. And that's, you know as well as I do, that's what your loved one, that's what the one you've lost would want for you as well. See, we have this odd Americanized view of life. Somebody sent me this week. I thought it was fascinating. Do you know that if you are, okay, these are numbers in the world. You know that 26% of our world does not live to the age of 14? You know that 66% of the people in this world die between the ages of 14 and 64? So if you're sitting here this morning and you are age 65 or older, here's what you need to understand. Only 8% of the world will make it to 65. 92% of the world will die before 65 years old. If you're here this morning and you're 65 or older, you need to understand how gracious God has been to you, and you need to understand how gracious God is to you, giving you another day every single day. If you're over 14, you should figure that out. And we have this Americanized thing that we should have X number of years and then all of this past it. And the reality of it is God has been so good to us. And as long as you're here, He's got a plan for you, and He's not done with you. So make it count. And I understand, like I say, I'm not minimizing the grief process, but the reality of it is, you know as well as I do, that our loved ones would want us to go on and not get stuck. And if you're one of those who's in a place where you're stuck, I beg you to start working through that process so that you can go forward. Yes, it's going to be an upside-down world. It's always going to be an upside-down world. But it is so important for us to realize as long as God has us here, He wants us to go forward. And one of the things you see in this story is Joseph and his brothers go forward. And I'm going to challenge you because I think sometimes we forget that. There is no reason to feel guilty for moving on. In fact, I would suggest this. If you really want to honor their life, go forward. Go forward. My best friend passed away a week after Claire was born. Doug got to see a picture of her. But that's all. And the reality of it is this: she never will get to know Doug. But if you think for a minute, my grandkids are going to grow up and not know all about Doug, you have another thing coming. Because the lessons that he represented, the values that he had, the things that I have an opportunity to teach my grandkids about him, it's my job to carry his legacy forward. It's my responsibility to share those stories. That's what I want to do as I go forward. That's how I can honor his memory. In fact, I mean, this is how crazy it is. You know, in my conversation yesterday with a total stranger, I'm talking about dead. I mean, he's been gone now almost 6 years. Over 6 years. And I just want to challenge you as we go forward with this, because this is so important for us. The reality of it is this. Every one of us are going to take our last breath one day. So you make today count. You make sure you're ready for what happens beyond this world. For me, I've made sure that I have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. So I'm ready to leave this world and go to the next. But while he's got me here, I want to make it count. And I want to honor the lives of the people that God has brought into my life. I want to share their stories. I want to share their legacy. I want to teach people the things that I learned from them. And even though they're no longer here, their stories continue on. Even in this story, did you notice how many times he mentioned his great-grandfather Abraham, who had bought the plot of land? None of these people had really met him. I end with this. Jacob leaves this world and focuses on his future. His family grieves his loss, but continues with life. Death for God's children is simply stepping from this world into an eternal world with our God and his children. As long as God allows us life in this world, he has a plan for us. Grief is a necessary and healthy process. But life has to go on here. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the day. And Lord, as we go through a story like this, it's tough because we're so focused on life that we don't like to spend a lot of time talking about death. And Lord, in a book that is completely focused on life, you spend a number of chapters talking about Jacob's death. So Lord, help us to be ready as well. And guide us through the grief process. Guide us as we work our way through learning how to live in a world that's been turned upside down, the loss of people we care about. So use us this week, these things we ask in your name. Amen. Let's stand together. We're going to sing.